So Durkheim was rather in the progressive camp of social reformers in his country, much as Max Weber was in Germany. The two founders were definitely more conservative than current day sociologists, but they were definitely also not revolutionaries such as Karl Marx. They were also not among the very conservative founders of sociology, as I would call them, who are a little bit the forgotten founders nowadays. And before going on with Durkheim's work, I briefly wanted to mention this, let's say, little noticed history of ideas of conservative also founders in the social sciences who usually do not make it into the textbooks of sociology. One reason is obviously that they often collaborated in regimes that were very conservative, counter-reactionary, or even authoritarian. So I'm talking of figures such as Edmund Burke or de Maistre, Bonald in the UK or France, Herder Hegel also in Germany, Comte I had mentioned already, but Frédéric Leplay, the main social scientist during Napoleon III's empire, are amongst the, let's say, conservative founders of the social sciences. There's also Wilhelm Riehl in Germany. Then in the 20th century, Spengler or Gehlen in Germany. So yes, you could write a history of ideas that is still unwritten of the sociological founders in the conservative camp. Let us briefly take an overlook on what they defended as positions and what kind of sociology they presented. So I reproduce here a little typology that René Raymond suggested here in his book on the history of the right wing conservative movements in France. And he divides them into these three different kind of political groups. The first one are the counter-revolutionaries, like de Maistre, for instance, who basically wanted to politically unwind the French Revolution, to basically um, go back to the ancient regime and put the old monarchical institutions back in place. Then in the 1830s, Raymond identifies the National Liberals as conservatives who were predominantly conservative on the political sense. So they accepted already the new kind of economic order, but still wanted it to be in the old sort of set of monarchical institutions. And last but not least, for the 1850s, then he identifies the authoritarian nationalist type um, of conservatives, so the Napoleon III, for instance, who put an emphasis on a much more authoritarian order with also strong nationalist meanings. And Raymond would say that these three types of conservatives then were the archetypes for any kind of conservatives that would follow up, at least in the French system. One other way of thinking about typologies of conservatives is here by Stefan Breuer, who developed this more for the German conservative movements. And he um, draws up a table of 2 by 2, if you want. One is along the dimension of whether conservatives reject the modern capitalist economy, modern industry, or whether they want to integrate it. The other dimension is whether they accept, or want to include, or exclude the new social strata in the old strata that was predominant in the ancient regime. You can combine these 2 by 2 and you have four potential conservative types. And all of these make up, let's say, the political landscape in which conservative movements may operate. Yeah. what kind of views do conservatives then hold politically, but also, let's say, more sociologically? So the first one is to say that society is not what liberals would say, malleable by individual choices. It is something that is inherited. Individuals can hardly change it. There is something like the supra individual past that is stored in every individual. So communitarians nowadays would probably defend also such a view. In other words, society is then in three senses prior to the individual. The first sense is simply historically, society has somehow always been there. I mean, there is the um, very fictitious story of contractualist, of this original signing of a contract to construct society in the Rousseauian sense. But yeah, conservative thinkers would disagree with this and see society as historically always prior to individuals. Um, they would also defend a kind of ontological holism, as we called it in the first lectures, that is, society is more than the sum of its parts. It's somehow supra individual. It persists in somehow independently, even though somehow also dependent on individuals. And the third view then sees societies as not only ontologically somehow prior, but also ethically. So that whenever there is a conflict between societal interests and individual interests, then conservatives would claim it is the societal interest that primes, that has the priority in that case. Um, so, what kind of view do conservative sociologists then have of the stratification in society? Well, society is very traditionally organized along status groups, right? It's not along economic classes necessarily, but status groups which are put into a hierarchy. And they are also incorporated groups. So that the economy, for instance, is made up of different corporations, right? Think about tradesmen or different trades, the brewers and the butchers, etc., organizing in guilds, for instance, such that the basic unit of analysis also in a society but also the constitutive basic unit is not the individual, but are these groups. This goes a little bit against then one of the main laws also of the French Revolution, the Loi Chapelier, which prohibited right these traditional groups, starting from the idea that individuals should act in the economy and not um, guilds, for instance, that inhibit competition. Um, the political system then for conservatives is then mainly just authority based. It's not democratic. Constitutional monarchy is perhaps the compromise then chosen in the 19th century. And let's say it's no wonder perhaps to say that conservatives also propose religion and any kind of rituals as the kind of order that um, holds societies together, in particular against the problem then of the rising big industrial cities, which was one of the main reasons also for these conservative social scientists and thinkers to become active. Um, Also interesting to see what kind of methodology then these traditional sociologists then proposed. So one is just early social surveys. Frédéric Leplay here in France has done most to elaborate just a method of surveys, participant observation, even going out to the ordinary people and studying their customs and traditions, something that also was distilled in this notion of the Volkskunde in the more German speaking parts in Europe, but yeah, also in Slavic countries. Um, and in that debate about erklären versus verstehen, so explaining or understanding, then these conservative thinkers rather proposed the verstehen tradition, so the idea of an emphatic kind of understanding of what um, ordinary people and traditions really meant in a certain culture. So directed against the rather rationalistic kind of explanation. Um, okay, so that was just a little digression to also mention the sociologists who usually don't make it into the textbooks of nowadays, but there were also in the history of sociology, let's say, more traditionally, more conservatively inclined thinkers. Let's get back to Durkheim. You may have also noticed that already that Durkheim's thinking is sometimes not too far away from these conservative positions, but in other ways he is. So Durkheim writes in the tradition also of Herbert Spencer. We saw that. So in a way, it agrees also with many of the statements of Spencer's, and one important agreement is that Durkheim also thinks that the division of labor is sort of the main element that holds modern societies together. Yeah, and here he agrees with Smith and Spencer in distinguishing modern societies from traditional societies by this new form of interdependence, which is the division of labor. Just that Durkheim does not only see the division of labor in a very functional sense as generating more and more wealth, he also sees in the division of labor a new kind of social integration mechanism. And this is something unique then also to Durkheim. He disagrees then, however, about, let's say, the causal and conditional order between the social differentiation and the economic differentiation. So he sees social differentiation as prior to the economic division of labor, or to paraphrase one of his famous quotes, he sees the so-called non-contractual elements of the contract as conditioning the existence also and success of an economic contract. So to put it simply, um, if you have economic individuals, they do not naturally agree and sign contracts and engage in a division of labor. They always need a common set of norms, for instance, a common set of understandings and traditions, for instance, also of implicit responsibilities that make a contract and the division of labor work. Just one example. There needs to be a certain understanding, for instance, between a tenant and a landlord, for instance, of what both sides should be able to do it. You cannot write every tiny detail into a contract. Then you end up with infinite kind of contracts. So Durkheim would argue there are traditions, implicit norms, and understandings which are necessary for contracts and hence also the division of labor to work. And this is meant with the non-contractual sort of priors of the economic contracts. And this is a clear disagreement of Durkheim's here with economists or Spencer liberals at the time, who thought about societies in much more, let's say, detached